The courtroom
court
was
has reached
already
its
full
verdict.
before the hearing even started. People sat quietly on the wooden benches,
The consequences
whispering
of
to
this
each
decision
other
are irreversible.
while waiting for the
I
judge to
understand, but
arrive.
we must proceed.
Papers shuffled,
Then we are
chairs
committed.
creaked, and the
You
low
can't
sound of
ignore the
conversation
evidence.
filled the room.
The evidence is
It
being
was just
reviewed,
another
sir.
busy morning in the
Reviewed, this is a
courthouse,
cover-up.
where people came every day with their problems, their fears, and their hopes for justice. Near the back of the room sat a man in a worn gray suit. The fabric looked a little old, and the sleeves were slightly faded at the edges, but everything about the way he wore it showed he had tried his best to look respectable. His shoes were polished carefully, even though the leather had begun to crack with age. Pinned neatly to the left side of his jacket were several military medals. They were arranged in a straight line, shining softly under the lights of courtroom. Anyone who looked closely could see they were not decorations someone would normally wear to court. They looked important, heavy, meaningful. The man sat quietly, his hands folded together. His face looked calm, but the tension in his shoulders told another story. Beside him sat a young child, swinging their legs slowly above the floor. The child looked around the courtroom with wide eyes, clearly unsure about what was happening. The father leaned down slightly and whispered something gentle. The child nodded and tried to sit still. This hearing meant everything to him. For months he'd been fighting through legal paperwork, meetings, and long waiting days just to stand in this room. Being a single father had never been easy, but the recent problems had made life even harder. Bills had piled up, work had become uncertain, and people had started questioning whether he could truly take care of his child alone. Still, he never stopped trying. He had worked different jobs, sometimes 2 in one day, just to keep food on the table. Late at night, after his child had gone to sleep, he would sit quietly at the kitchen table studying documents from the court, trying to understand every detail. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't know much about legal rules, but he knew he had to fight. A loud sound suddenly echoed through the room as a door behind the judge's desk opened. "Everyone rise," the court officer announced. The room instantly stood up. The judge walked in with a serious expression. His robe flowed behind him as he approached the bench. His face showed the tired look of someone who had spent many years listening to arguments and making decisions about people's lives. Everyone sat again as the judge adjusted the papers in front of him. The morning hearings began one by one. Different cases were called forward. Some people argued loudly with lawyers. Others spoke softly about their struggles. The judge listened, asked questions, and moved quickly through each case. Nearly an hour passed. Finally, the clerk called the next case. The single father slowly stood up. He gently placed a reassuring hand on his child's shoulder before walking toward the front of the courtroom. His steps were steady, but each one carried the weight of months of worry. When he reached the front, he stood respectfully before the judge. The judge glanced down at the paperwork first. Then his eyes slowly lifted. They stopped on the medals. For a moment, the judge said nothing. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "Well," the judge said slowly, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "this is something you don't see every day." Several people in the audience turned their heads, trying to see what the judge was looking at. The judge tapped his pen against the desk. "You came to court wearing medals?" The father remained calm. "Yes, Your Honor," he said politely. The judge tilted his head slightly, studying them with a skeptical look. "These are military medals, correct?" "Yes, sir." A faint murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward again and squinted slightly, as if trying to inspect them from a distance. "Interesting," he said, his voice now carrying a tone that made some people exchange glances. The father stood still, his hands calmly at his sides. "I must say," the judge continued, "I have seen many people come into this courtroom trying to impress others." A few quiet chuckles came from the benches behind. "But wearing medals like this to a legal hearing, that is certainly creative." The chuckles grew a little louder. The father's expression did not change, but the muscles in his jaw tightened slightly. The judge flipped through the papers again. "You claim to be a veteran?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you expect this court to believe that these medals are real?" The room suddenly became quieter. The father blinked once, surprised by the question. "They are real, sir." The judge leaned back again, crossing his arms slowly. "I've been in this courtroom for many years," he said, "and I've seen people exaggerate their stories more times than I can count. Another whisper moved through the crowd. The judge pointed lightly with his pen toward the medals. These looked dramatic. More quiet laughter came from the benches. The father felt every sound like a small weight pressing against his chest. Still, he remained respectful. They were given to me during my service, Your Honor. The judge shook his head slightly. You understand that this is a courtroom, not a stage. The words hung in the air. The father opened his mouth slightly, wanting to explain more, but the judge continued speaking before he could. People sometimes try to gain sympathy by presenting themselves as heroes. The judge said, It happens more often than you would think. The child sitting behind the gallery watched quietly, sensing something uncomfortable was happening. The father glanced back for a brief moment, offering a small reassuring smile before turning forward again. Your Honor, he said calmly, I am not here for sympathy. The judge raised an eyebrow. No, sir. I'm here for my child. For a moment, the room fell silent. Even the whispers stopped. But the judge didn't seem convinced. He leaned forward again and tapped the desk lightly. If these medals are legitimate, there should be records somewhere. There are, the father replied. The judge gave a short shrug. Well, until I see those records, I find it difficult to take this display seriously. A man sitting in the back row quietly whispered something to the person beside him, and they both smiled. The father felt the heat of embarrassment rise slowly in his face, but he refused to react. Years earlier, he had learned something during difficult moments far away from home. Sometimes the strongest response was silence. The judge looked down at the case documents again. Let's focus on the actual issue here, he said. He began reading aloud about the father's financial situation, employment history, and the claims being made about his ability to provide a stable home. Some of the words sounded cold when spoken out loud. Struggle with work, limited income, uncertain stability. Each phrase felt heavier than the last. Still, the father listened without interrupting. He had faced harder things before. Finally, the judge stopped reading. He looked up again at the medals. You know, he said slowly, if these truly were earned, they would represent serious achievements. The father nodded once. They were. The judge gave a small, doubtful smile. Yes, well, he adjusted the papers again and reached for his pen. Until this court receives official verification, I will consider these accessories. A quiet ripple of laughter spread across the room. The father lowered his eyes briefly, not in shame, but in patience. He had come to this courtroom prepared for many things, but he had not expected this. The judge then said something that made the entire room suddenly tense. Perhaps, he said, it would be best if you remove them. The father looked up slowly. Your Honor, the medals, the judge repeated, pointing with his pen. They may distract from the proceedings. For the first time, the father hesitated. His fingers slowly touched the edge of one medal. Each one carried a memory. Each one carried a story. Removing them felt like something far heavier than taking off a piece of metal. The courtroom waited. Some people leaned forward slightly in their seats. The judge tapped his pen impatiently. Well, the father took a slow breath, just as he was about to respond. The heavy courtroom doors suddenly opened. The loud sound echoed across the entire room. Every head turned at once. Footsteps followed. Slow, firm, confident. Someone had just entered the courtroom, and from the sudden silence spreading across the room, it was clear this was no ordinary interruption. The heavy courtroom doors had barely stopped moving when the entire room fell into complete silence. Conversations that had been whispering only seconds earlier suddenly disappeared. Every person in the courtroom turned their head toward the entrance. 3 figures stood in the doorway. 2 of them were wearing clean military uniforms. Their posture was straight and disciplined, their faces serious. Between them walked an older officer whose presence immediately changed the feeling inside the room. His uniform carried several rows of ribbons and decorations. His shoulders carried the rank of a high-ranking officer. Even people who knew little about the military could tell he was someone important. The steady sound of his boots echoed across the wooden floor as he walked inside. The court officer looked confused for a moment, but did not stop him. The judge frowned slightly from behind the bench. This is a courtroom, the judge said firmly. Proceedings are already underway. The officer stopped a few steps inside the room. He looked around briefly, taking in the faces, the quiet tension, and finally the man standing near the front with the medals on his chest. For a brief second, his expression softened. Then he turned his attention toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, his voice calm but strong. "I apologize for the interruption." The judge leaned back slightly, studying him. "And you are?" The officer stepped forward slowly, a representative of the United States Armed Forces. A ripple of whispers moved through the benches. People leaned closer to one another, trying to understand what was happening. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Well," he said carefully, "this is highly unusual." "Yes, Your Honor," the officer replied, "but I believe it is necessary." The judge glanced briefly at the clock on the wall. "This court does not normally allow unexpected interruptions." "I understand," the officer said calmly, "but what I heard just moments ago makes it important that I speak." The room became even quieter. The judge folded his hands together on the desk. "What exactly did you hear?" The officer turned slightly and looked toward the man standing before the bench. His eyes moved slowly across the medals pinned carefully to the jacket. Then he looked back toward the judge. "I heard those medals being questioned." The words hung in the air. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge cleared his throat. "This court simply requested verification. That is standard procedure." "Yes, Your Honor," the officer replied. "Verification is important." He paused briefly. "But so is respect." The room felt suddenly heavier. The father standing near the front remained completely still. His eyes moved toward the officer, clearly surprised. He had not expected anyone to walk into the courtroom on his behalf. The officer then did something that shocked nearly everyone watching. Instead of continuing to speak to the judge, he turned and walked directly toward the father. Each step was steady and deliberate. When he reached him, he stopped. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The father's eyes widened slightly as recognition slowly appeared on his face. The officer's expression softened again. Then, in front of the entire courtroom, the officer raised his hand and gave a sharp, formal salute. The sound of his hand reaching his brow was clear in the silent room. Gasps spread across the benches. A few people leaned forward in disbelief. The father stood frozen for a moment. Slowly, almost automatically, he returned the salute. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The judge sat up straighter behind the bench. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "What exactly is happening here?" The officer lowered his hand and turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "the man standing here is not someone pretending to be a soldier." The judge's expression tightened slightly. "I never made that claim directly." The officer nodded slightly, but it was suggested. The courtroom remained completely silent now. Even the people who had laughed earlier were watching carefully. The officer continued. "The medals he is wearing are not decorations purchased from a store." He pointed gently toward the father's chest. "Those were earned under circumstances most people will never experience." The judge shifted slightly in his chair. "And you know this how?" The officer looked at him steadily. "Because I was there." A quiet wave of surprise moved across the room. The judge's eyebrows lifted. "You're saying you witnessed these events personally?" "Yes, Your Honor." The officer's voice remained calm, but there was weight behind every word. "Many years ago, during an overseas mission, there was a situation where several soldiers were trapped after an attack." The courtroom listeners leaned forward without realizing it. The officer continued slowly. "It was chaotic. Visibility was poor. Communication had broken down. Several men were injured." He paused briefly. Many people believed the situation was hopeless. The judge watched him carefully now. "But this man," the officer said, nodding toward the father, "did not give up." The father lowered his eyes slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The officer continued. "He moved through a dangerous area multiple times to pull wounded soldiers to safety." The room stayed completely silent. "One of those soldiers," the officer added quietly, "was me." A soft gasp came from somewhere in the back of the courtroom. The judge blinked slowly. "You're saying he saved your life?" Yes, Your Honor. The officer spoke without hesitation. If not for his actions that day, several families would have received very different news. The father shifted slightly, clearly wishing the moment would pass. He had never liked being the center of attention. The judge leaned forward, studying the medals again. And these decorations represent that service? Yes. The officer took a slow breath. They represent courage, sacrifice, and decisions made under extreme pressure. The judge looked thoughtful now, though his expression still carried a hint of doubt. And you're certain they're authentic? The officer's eyes met the judge's directly. There is no doubt. The judge tapped his pen slowly against the desk. The quiet tapping echoed in the silent room. People watched carefully, waiting to see what he would say next. The officer then added something that made several people shift in their seats again. What concerns me, he said calmly, is not the request for verification. The judge raised an eyebrow. But the way those medals were spoken about. The room felt tense again. The judge straightened slightly. This court was simply maintaining order. I understand, the officer replied, but words carry weight. He glanced briefly toward the benches where some people had laughed earlier. When a soldier's service is dismissed publicly, it does not only affect the person wearing the medals. His voice remained respectful but firm. It affects every person who has worn the same uniform. The judge remained silent. For the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty appeared in his expression. The officer then turned slightly and looked at the child sitting behind. The child had been watching everything quietly. He gave a small, kind smile before turning back toward the judge. That child, the officer said gently, should never have to watch their parents' service treated as a joke. The room stayed completely silent. The judge slowly removed his glasses and set them on the desk. He looked again at the father, then at the medals, then back at the officer. You are making serious statements in this courtroom. Yes, Your Honor. The officer nodded once. And I stand by every word. The judge leaned back in his chair, thinking. Several seconds passed. No one moved. Then the judge finally spoke again. Well, this situation has clearly become more complicated than I expected. The officer remained calm. That tends to happen when the full story has not yet been heard. The judge folded his hands together. And you believe there is more to the story? The officer looked once more toward the father standing beside him. Yes, he said quietly. There is much more. The courtroom waited. The judge looked toward the clerk, then back at the officer. And you intend to explain it now? The officer gave a slow nod. If the court allows it. The judge hesitated. Then he gestured toward the front of the room. Very well. The officer took a small step forward. The entire courtroom leaned into the moment. What he was about to reveal next would change the entire hearing. The officer took a deep breath and began speaking slowly, carefully choosing each word. He looked across the courtroom at the father, and then back toward the judge. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. Years ago, he began, there was a mission overseas. It was one of the most dangerous situations any of us had faced. Our unit was sent to a remote area, knowing that the enemy presence was heavy. Communication was limited, and every step carried risk. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The audience in the courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, as though he could feel the tension of that moment through the officer's words. During that mission, the officer continued, our group was ambushed. Explosions happened so fast that it was almost impossible to react. Smoke filled the air and chaos surrounded us. Several soldiers were injured, some seriously. It seemed impossible to move them without putting everyone's lives at risk. He looked directly at the father now, his gaze steady. It was then that this man stepped forward. Without hesitation, he moved through the dangerous zone multiple times. Each trip he carried wounded soldiers to safety, not caring about his own life. The courtroom stayed completely silent. A few people clutched their seats. The child in the gallery leaned slightly forward, eyes wide, tried to understand what was happening. One of the soldiers he saved was me. The officer said quietly, I would not be standing here today if it were not for him. The father's chest rose slightly, but he did not speak. His hands were still at his sides, but his eyes held a faint glimmer of surprise and modesty. He had never liked telling this story. He had faced danger many times, but he had never sought praise. These medals, the officer said, pointing toward the father's chest, are not just pieces of metal. They are symbols of courage, sacrifice, and decisions made in moments when most people would have frozen. He took another breath. This man never sought attention for what he did. He never spoke about the fear, the pain, or the injuries he endured. He only focused on helping others and completing the mission. A few people in the gallery whispered quietly to each other. They were beginning to understand that the man standing before the judge was far more than they had realized. When I first saw him move through that dangerous area, the officer continued, I thought I would lose him, but he didn't stop. Even when explosions happened near him, when bullets were flying, he continued, and he did not just save our lives physically. He kept our hope alive when all seemed lost. The judge shifted in his chair, clearly listening more intently now. He had seen many cases, but he had never witnessed something like this in his courtroom before. The father here, the officer said, carried more than just wounded soldiers. He carried their family's hope. Every time he returned with someone alive, it meant that a family would be able to see their loved one again. He carried their future in his hands. The courtroom was heavy with emotion. Even people who had come for other hearings were watching now. Some faces reflected shock, others respect, and a few eyes glistened with tears. It was not just a single act of bravery, the officer continued. It was consistent courage. Every moment was a choice to face danger for the sake of others. This is why these medals are here. They are proof of that courage. They are proof of his commitment to something far bigger than himself. He paused and looked at the father again. I remember the moment he came back one last time. We were all exhausted, bleeding, and uncertain if anyone would make it. He returned with the last of us. He was battered, bruised, and tired beyond words. But he didn't complain. He didn't seek recognition. He only made sure everyone else was safe. The father's hands were now clasped loosely in front of him. He looked at the medals and gently touched one, a memory flashing through his mind. The room remained silent, as if everyone understood the weight of those memories without needing them explained. I have known many soldiers in my life, the officer said softly, but very few exhibit the kind of quiet determination that this man has. He never asked for reward or fame. His only concern was the safety of those around him. And today, even in a courtroom thousands of miles away from that mission, those same qualities remain. The judge leaned back in his chair, silent for the first time. He had listened to countless arguments about evidence, finances, and custody, but he had never felt the kind of raw, human truth that filled this room right now. The seriousness of the officer's words could not be ignored. I stand here, the officer continued, to make sure that what happened in this courtroom does not diminish what he earned. These medals are not fake. They are a testament to his service and sacrifice, and they deserve respect. The father lowered his head slightly, not because he felt embarrassed, but because the weight of the truth and the recognition pressed on him. He had lived through events that most people could not imagine, and he had never sought applause for them. He glanced at the child sitting behind him. The child's small hands were folded in their lap, eyes wide and full of awe. This was the moment the father had wanted for his child. Not the recognition for himself, but for his child to see the honor, courage, and integrity that had carried them through life. The officer straightened and took a step back. He looked at the judge one last time. I am willing to provide full documentation, witness statements, and verification of his service, Your Honor. Everything I have said can be confirmed. The judge's hands rested on the desk. His fingers steepled together. He studied the father, the medals, and the officer. For the first time, doubt in the father's honor seemed impossible. A few people in the audience began to whisper quietly, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded with respect. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. The judge finally spoke. I see now that I may have underestimated the significance of these medals and the man who earned them. The officer nodded respectfully. It is not about underestimating your honor. It is about recognizing that true courage and service cannot be judged by appearances. The father remained silent, letting the officer's words carry the truth for him. He had always believed that action spoke louder than words, and in this courtroom, They were speaking louder than ever before. The judge looked once more at the medals and then at the father. There was a pause, a quiet moment where the weight of the past and the reality of the present filled the room. Every person in that courtroom understood, even if only on some level, that something rare and honorable was standing right before them. The officer then turned toward the audience, giving a gentle nod. It was clear that he had completed what he had come to do. His presence had changed the energy in the room. The father had been vindicated before any papers were signed, before any ruling was made. The child behind him blinked, trying to process the moment. Slowly, the small face broke into a quiet smile. The father looked at the child and returned the smile, small but full of meaning. It was not just about medals or recognition. It was about truth, honor, and the realization that integrity could not be questioned when it had been proven through action. The judge finally spoke again. "We will need to verify the details through proper channels," he said, his voice more measured now, almost reverent. "But I see clearly that this man's service is genuine and deserving of respect." The father nodded slightly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had faced ridicule, doubt, and embarrassment in this very room. But in that moment, the truth stood firmly in his favor. The officer gave a final nod to the father before turning toward the doors. The two uniformed officers behind him followed silently, the sound of their boots fading as they left the room. The courtroom remained quiet for a few seconds longer, as if no one could yet process what had just happened. The judge adjusted his papers, looking at the father with a new level of understanding. "You may be seated," he said softly. The father guided his child back to the seat, their small hand slipping into his. Both sat quietly, absorbing the change that had occurred in the room. People around them whispered softly, some offering looks of respect, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the unexpected turn of events. For the father, it was not just about clearing his name. It was about showing his child what courage, patience, and humility looked like in the face of doubt. It was a lesson that could not be taught in books or schools. And in that quiet courtroom, as the echoes of the officer's story lingered, everyone present understood that real bravery often goes unnoticed, but when it is finally recognized, it leaves a mark that cannot be ignored. The courtroom was still quiet after the officer left. The silence felt heavy, but it was not the uncomfortable silence from before. This was a silence full of thought and reflection. People shifted in their seats, and the judge leaned slightly forward, as if trying to understand more than just the words he had heard. The father sat back down carefully, keeping his child close. The child's small hand was wrapped around his finger, drawing comfort from the familiar warmth. For a moment, they both simply sat and listened to the soft murmurs spreading through the audience. Whispers of respect, curiosity, and surprise floated through the room. The judge adjusted the papers in front of him, but did not speak immediately. He seemed to be replaying the officer's story in his mind, weighing it against the way he had spoken to the father just minutes ago. There was a pause before he finally looked up. "I must admit," he said carefully, "I had little understanding of what truly happened. I focused only on the paperwork and the appearance. I now realize that what was suggested about these medals does not reflect the truth." His voice softened. "And I regret that my words may have caused distress." The father nodded slightly, accepting the acknowledgement without speaking. Words had never been his strength. Action was. He had always believed that the right choices would speak louder than anything else. "I would like to understand more about this man," the judge continued. "His life after service, how he has managed as a single parent, and what led his presence here today." He glanced at the father. "It is important for this court to see the full picture." The father shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the moment. He took a deep breath and began to speak softly, his voice calm but steady. "After my service, life was not easy. I came home with injuries that were not always visible. Pain followed me every day, and some nights were hard to sleep. I tried to adjust, but it was a challenge." He paused for a moment, looking down at the child beside him. "Then I became responsible for raising my child alone. There were no easy days, and every decision felt heavy. I worked multiple jobs to provide food, a home, and a sense of stability. Every day I asked myself if I was doing enough, if I could be enough." The courtroom listened quietly. There was no hint of complaint in his words, only a calm honesty that resonated deeply. People shifted in their seats, understanding that the man who had saved lives overseas was now facing another kind of battle at home. There were moments, he continued, when I doubted myself. When the court proceedings started, it felt like all those struggles were being questioned. I came here to do what was right, to protect my child's future. Nothing else mattered. The judge nodded slowly. He had listened to countless testimonies in his years, but rarely had he heard one that combined courage, sacrifice, and quiet determination in this way. I understand your honor, he said finally, and I appreciate your honesty. It is clear that this man's service extended beyond the battlefield and into the life he built for his child. I will make sure that the record reflects that. He looked down at the papers again, then back at the father. But there are still questions about his financial situation and his ability to provide a stable home. We must address that. The father's expression did not change, but he nodded. I have maintained steady employment, Your Honor. It has been difficult at times, but I have never neglected my responsibilities. My child's well-being has always been my priority. The judge studied him for a long moment. The way he spoke was honest, direct, and without exaggeration. The courtroom could sense that he was not seeking pity, only fairness. Can you provide proof of your work and income? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, the father replied calmly. He handed over the documents he had brought, carefully organized and complete. Each sheet represented months of effort, late nights, and meticulous care. It was not just paperwork. It was proof of resilience, dedication, and responsibility. The judge reviewed the documents quietly, flipping through the pages. He looked at the child, then back at the father. It appears you have made every effort to provide for your child. That is clear. He paused, considering the medals again, and then added, It is also clear that your service and your dedication to raising your child should be acknowledged. The earlier comments made in this courtroom were inappropriate, and I apologize for any distress caused. The father nodded again. This time, he allowed himself a small breath of relief. It was not the kind of relief that came from winning a battle, but the relief that came from being understood and recognized. For the first time that morning, he felt the burden of doubt begin to lift. The judge continued, I will ensure that the court record reflects your service accurately. Additionally, the evaluation of your custody and financial situation will take into account the circumstances you described and the proof you provided. There was a soft murmur among the audience, a mixture of approval and admiration. The child looked up at the father and smiled, sensing the shift in energy. It was a quiet but powerful moment, a small victory that carried the weight of years of struggle. The father spoke again, his voice gentle. I only want what is best for my child. That has always been my goal. The rest, the recognition, the approval, it is secondary. I am proud to serve, yes, but my child's safety, happiness, and future matter far more. The judge nodded. That is clear and it is commendable. It is rare to see someone balance such challenges with such integrity. He paused and looked at the audience. Let this courtroom remember that service, courage, and commitment extend beyond medals and battlefields. They are reflected in the daily choices we make, the sacrifices we accept, and the love we show to those who depend on us. The father's child squeezed his hand slightly. He looked down at the small hand and smiled, a mixture of pride and quiet gratitude filling him. In that moment, the struggles, the doubts, and the ridicule seemed far away. What mattered was truth, integrity, and a recognition that action spoke louder than words. The judge cleared his throat and spoke again. This court will proceed with fairness and care. Your service and your dedication to your child will be reflected in the decisions made here. Any prior misjudgments are acknowledged, and I will ensure that respect is given where it is due. People in the courtroom began to sit a little straighter, some nodding quietly to themselves. The mood had shifted completely from skepticism and laughter to respect and admiration. What had started as a routine hearing had become a lesson in humility, courage, and human dignity. The father finally relaxed his shoulders slightly. He had faced ridicule, doubt, and scrutiny, but he had also seen truth prevail. In that moment, he felt not just vindicated, but understood. That understanding was worth more than any medal, more than any ruling. The judge looked at him one last time. You have shown great strength, both in service and in life. That will not be overlooked. The father nodded quietly, his eyes meeting his child's. They shared a moment of silent communication, one that needed no words. It was a moment of reassurance, love, and quiet triumph. Together, they had faced uncertainty, and together they had been recognized. The courtroom slowly began to return to normal. People whispered quietly among themselves, some expressing admiration, others reflecting on what they had witnessed. It was clear that everyone present would remember this day, not just for the ruling, but for the story of courage, honesty, and human dignity that had unfolded before them. The father held his child's hand as they prepared to leave the front of the courtroom. The weight of fear and doubt that had pressed on him all morning had lifted. He had faced a judge, an audience, and skepticism with calm and honesty. And now he had been understood. As they walked back to their seats, the father glanced at the medals still pinned to his chest. They were not just metal. They were reminders of past courage, sacrifices made and challenges overcome. But more importantly, they were symbols of integrity, humility, and the strength to continue doing what was right. The judge watched quietly, making notes on the case file. He had seen many hearings, but few like this. He realized that justice was not just about papers and rules. It was about understanding the people who live with the consequences of those rules every day. And in that quiet, reflective courtroom, everyone present understood that true courage and service could never be fully measured, only recognized when revealed through honest words, actions, and the lives touched along the way. The courtroom felt lighter as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. The tension from earlier had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. People still whispered softly among themselves, but it was no longer skepticism or judgment. It was reflection and respect. The father sat with his child beside him. Their hands were intertwined, a small but firm connection that carried reassurance and love. It had been a long journey to reach this point, but the past hours had made it clear that truth and integrity could stand firm even in the face of doubt. The judge shuffled his papers and looked up, meeting the father's eyes. "I have reviewed the evidence, your testimony, and the documentation provided. It is clear that your service is genuine and that your dedication to your child is unwavering." The father nodded silently, acknowledging the words without speaking. Words had never been necessary to define who he was. Actions always had. "I also wish to apologize formally for the earlier comments about your medals. It was not my place to question their authenticity in that way. Respect is due, and I recognize that now," the judge said, his voice calm and sincere. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the audience. People had seen the moment, had witnessed the officer's testimony, and now heard the judge's acknowledgement. The energy in the room had changed completely. What had started as embarrassment and ridicule was now recognition and understanding. The father's child looked up at him with wide eyes, sensing the shift in tone. The small smile that crept across the child's face was mirrored in the father's own eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that they had endured this challenge together. Every day of struggle, every long night of worry, had led to this moment of clarity and justice. The judge continued, "I am also taking into account your financial stability and your ability to provide a safe, loving environment for your child. The documentation provided confirms your consistent effort and determination. It is clear that you have prioritized your child's welfare above all else." He paused, looking around the room. This court recognizes that life presents challenges, and it is not the absence of difficulty that defines good parenting, but the effort and integrity shown in facing those difficulties. The father shifted slightly, allowing himself a small breath of relief. It was a kind of relief that came not from winning a battle, but from being understood, seen, and respected for the life he had lived and the sacrifices he had made. The judge leaned back in his chair, his tone softening further. "I will ensure that all records reflect your service accurately. This court will proceed with fairness in determining custody and support arrangements. Your commitment to your child, along with your demonstrated responsibility and character, will be fully recognized." The courtroom remained quiet, every person absorbing the weight of his words. The father looked at the medals still pinned to his chest. Each one represented a moment of courage, a choice made under pressure, a life saved, and a sacrifice endured. But more than that, they represented resilience, integrity, and the continuation of his mission to protect and guide his child. The child squeezed the father's hand, sensing the relief and understanding that had been achieved. There was no need for elaborate celebrations. The small smile and quiet comfort were more than enough. The judge then addressed the room as a whole. Let this courtroom be reminded that true service is not only measured by medals or recognition. It is seen in the choices we make, the sacrifices we accept, and the love we show to those who depend on us. This man's actions exemplify those principles. Heads nodded in agreement. Some people in the audience were visibly moved. Others sat in thoughtful silence. It was a rare moment when the weight of human courage and responsibility could be felt by everyone present, not just those directly involved. The father finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. I have never sought recognition for what I have done. My focus has always been my child, but I appreciate the acknowledgement. It reminds me that doing what is right, even in silence, has meaning. The judge nodded slowly. It does, indeed, and your efforts, both in service and in life, will be treated with the respect they deserve. A soft murmur of agreement passed through the courtroom. The atmosphere was calm, reflective, and deeply respectful. For the first time that day, the father felt the full weight of justice, not just in the legal sense, but in the sense of being understood and honored for who he was. He glanced down at his child, whose eyes were still wide with wonder. The small hand squeezed as once more, and the father felt a warmth that went far beyond relief. It was pride, love, and the quiet knowledge that the challenges they had faced together had made them stronger. The judge concluded the session by stating that the custody arrangement and financial decisions would proceed with fairness, taking into full account the father's dedication, stability, and proven character. He reiterated the importance of respect for service and the recognition of actions over appearances. As the session ended, people began to rise from their seats, moving slowly but with a new energy. Whispers of admiration and reflection filled the room. Even those who had entered with no knowledge of the father's story left with a deep sense of respect and a renewed understanding of courage and dedication. The father gathered his child's hand and stood slowly. They walked toward the exit, feeling lighter, stronger, and more connected than before. Every step carried the quiet satisfaction of having faced doubt, ridicule, and challenges, and having been recognized for the integrity and bravery that defined their lives. As they passed through the courtroom doors, the father glanced once more at the medals pinned to his chest. They were more than decorations. They were reminders of the past, proof of service, and symbols of resilience and love. The child looked up at him and smiled, a small but powerful expression that said more than words ever could. The father returned the smile, feeling the strength of their bond and the promise of a future built on courage, integrity, and mutual respect. Outside, the sun shone brightly, and the air felt fresh and full of possibility. For the father and his child, it was more than just another day. It was a day of recognition, understanding, and hope, a day when the truth prevailed and human dignity shone through even in the face of doubt. And as they walked together, hand in hand, the father carried not just the weight of his medals, but the quiet, enduring strength of a life lived with courage, love, and unwavering commitment to what truly mattered.